First off with this live stream, we're going to show the my Patreon. Sorry about that for a second. With that, I forgot to put my microphone in front. But we're going to show off with the Patreon of my for anybody who wants to donate. Next, we're basically going to go over with this one is the whole thing's going on in Venezuela. Now, with the whole thing, at first, with it, we need to understand that we need to go under what the actual definition of socialism is first, which we get that from Merriam-Webster. Basically is any of various economic or political theories advocating collective or government ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods, a system of society or group living where there's no private property, a system or condition of society where the means of production are owned and controlled by the state. It's very simple with it. It is very anti-liberty form of government. So we're not going to announce this as being some type of thing where we're going to be pro Maduro with this and state that he's some benevolent leader. But we're also going to be realistic with this and state what's really going on. We need to go with who the two major players are and the people that are affected, and show that there are other there's another minor group that essentially doesn't have currently a leader, but has actually been shown out there that actually looks kind of interesting. The minor group out there has been seen with showing Ron Paul posters, which is within the country. This group is actually never advocated for any violence, and that's one group that needs to be looked at. This group is one that is actually quite interesting. Number two is we have the Maduro government. Now, the Maduro government is another group that needs to be looked at as well. Now, while they have in the past done violence against protesters, their current status is not to do violence against them. This is because they do not want to essentially create the option of having interventionists come within their country. They do not want to basically give them fuel for this situation. While they're not exactly going to be the most peaceful, they're not exactly going to essentially want to stir up a situation. Though that's not the same case when we're dealing with the Maduro, as opposed to the Maduro people, the Juan Guaido people. The Juan Guaido people are actually looking for confrontation. This is actually why, when it comes down to it, is people like John Bolton and Marco Rubio were actually disappointed that Guaido was not arrested. They wanted the confrontation, and Guaido was actually pushing for violent attacks on the government, and he's actually pushing for a violent overthrow from the actual from his small group of about 700 supporters. Which, if we look at the actual population of Venezuela, we're going to find out that this number of supporters is hardly enough to actually mean much. When we have nearly 32 million people, 700 supporters means nothing. This means that if he wants to declare himself president, he is president of nothing. That means he does not have anywhere close to not even a majority, not even a minority. He's a nobody. This group of about 700 people is about a group of nobody, because we could see that at 32 million you're talking maybe at 320 at 3.2 million, that would be about 10%. 310 310,000 or 320,000 would be about 1%. 32,000.1%. 3,200 people would be about 0.01%. Basically about 310 people, about 0.001%. So we're talking about 0.002% approximately, which is what he's dealing with for his support. This is so low, it's not even, it would not even register. When you're talking about an actual election, maybe from like a popular level, he would be so low he wouldn't even register on there. We have actually more people probably nationally that vote for like the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States of America, than actually would vote for him in a percentage margin. And this should give you an idea of how low his popularity is within a country. Now, to assert oneself as an actual president, you have to have at least somewhat around within that majority, or somewhat within the majority amount vote. Now, since he does not have this, he cannot even claim himself anywhere close to that. Since his supporters are about 700 people, we're talking he is basically a nothing but a fly speck on the actual political arena. Basically, what we're talking about is why it makes us want to think, why are they trying to basically make him as this asserted president? Well, when it comes down to it, is we need to look at the history of Juan Guaido. Juan Guaido has actually had training in regime change, and he actually got this training down in Mexico from United States people that were actually linked with the CIA. This isn't some conspiracy theory. This is actually put in declassified papers. So we know who Juan Guaido is. Juan Guaido has already been trained in this, and this is exactly what he's known for. When it comes down to his handlers that have been there, one of his people that have actually been right next to him is actually a high-level CIA agent. And when we're talking about this reeks of the attempted coup of Maduro, and he's essentially meant to take over the spot, and very reminiscent of what we were trying to do in the 1950s with establishing the Shah in Iran. This looks very much like the same situation. We essentially import our leader that we want, and it's looking exactly like the same situation. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at a leader that's essentially going to be a puppet for not only the United States but also other Western countries. And it's basically put forth by a lot of these neoconservatives out there. Now, he's not going to be essentially this capitalist leader like we're hoping for, and it's going to put in freedom. He's not going to do anywhere close to that. When we're looking at what a capitalist leader would be, it would be something out of that other group that we're seeing that's going to essentially look for solutions that are non-intervention, and they're going to reject it. And this is why what we're seeing is we're seeing a small group around Guaido because they don't trust him. And he's not getting trust from his own people. And if they'd rather stick with Maduro, they would rather even stick with Maduro over Guaido. Guaido is not trusted because of his links with people like the U.S. CIA and people like John Bolton and other extremist people who want to overthrow governments and be very big in intervention. And this is not a factor of capitalism. We're not talking about voluntary exchange here. We're talking about violent force. And they don't want to go from one system of violent force to an even worse system of violent force. and they know what's going to happen, because when you go to that system, it's just going to be taken over by violent drug gangs, and that's what he's going to be beholden to. And it's going to make the system like they had for many years in Colombia, and still to a high degree still do, and it's going to make that much worse than it actually currently is. And that's going to only make Venezuela essentially drop to a much lower degree than they currently are, and they're going to essentially be one of the poorest countries in the world, and it's going to be something that's going to be highly corrupt. And they'd rather have socialism and have a slightly higher level of slightly lower level of corruption than they would under Guaido. Guaido is going to essentially give them such a horrible standard of living, and you don't want that. You want something that's going to be that's going to essentially let them determine their own level of freedom. And what they would want is ideally what they were getting during the 1970s and 1980s, where they were developing a lot of wealth. And what this wealth was coming from was a lot of freedom. And you're not going to get that through force. And what they're trying to do, they're trying to paint it as this guy's going to bring this stuff there, but the fact is he doesn't stand for any of it. He stands for the idea of force and submission and these things that are completely against what bring a great deal of wealth to Venezuela to begin with, and what made Venezuela one of the major financial hubs, what made Caracas one of the major financial hubs in the world during that period. And what needs to be understood is that while you were going to have some deal of poverty, it could have been easily solved by understanding that there were some definite problems that hit during the 90s. And what they needed to do was start to deregulate the system, and they would have gone right back up. But instead they went the wrong direction, and they went to more regulation and more and went down the road of socialism. Now, going to an actual person that's essentially going to be a tyrant, and the idea of Juan Guaido is not going to do anything. Because if you look what he stands for and what his background is, you're not going to get anything. This is why we need to view that the system of what they're offering right now is not good on either front, which is why the people are looking, which is why the bulk of the people out there are actually looking elsewhere. And which is why we need to look at the idea, if you want to help these countries out, they need to help themselves out. And which is why we get to the idea of not intervening in their affairs. And you're probably going to ask, well, why aren't people hearing this from a lot of the legacy media or from a lot of the pro-Trump sources out there? Well, because the fact is Trump has listened to people like John Bolton. So any of these sources that are pro-Trump are going to be spitting out what John Bolton is saying. And they're basically going to be the mouthpiece of John Bolton, regardless of what is the best interest of the United States, which is to essentially stay out of the affairs of other nations. The best interest of the United States is essentially just to worry about their own interests, which means not caring about the other nations and essentially removing all sanctions from other nations and just going about their own business. There should be no emotional affairs within other nations. We shouldn't be forcing other nations to act upon the will of the United States. I mean, that's not what capitalism is about. If we're going to go with capitalism, we should defend it as its own whole value, because we're not doing that. We're actually not even doing it within our own country when it comes to capitalism, because you look with all the social programs that we've added and with all the regulations we still have, and we're not exactly being a very good steward of capitalism. So when we're saying we want these other countries to adopt capitalism, well, if you want that to happen, you better start at home. And that's something that needs to be understood. And when we start looking at these things, is people need to understand that this is why you're not going to find it from these other stations. And people need to understand that basically is, yes, socialism is horrible because you're totally taking everything away from the people. It's theft. It's government slavery. But you can't basically say that just turning that government slavery down just a couple of notches and committing massive abuses of the people is any better, and basically having intervention from another country is any better. And that's basically what's happening here, is we're basically deciding what another country can do, and that's not legitimate. Because when we talk about what's happening in our own country, we have one party that is not happy with an election that took place over 2 years ago, and they're basically stating that we don't like what happened with the election, so we're trying to overthrow it. We're basically stating that this should be our president here. Well, it happened over 2 years ago, and you're basically trying to basically create a new leader. We've had a midterm in between, and you basically we already have people trying to run for the next general election for president, and you're still basically complaining about the last general election, and you're still having an investigation that's based on complete lies. And you're basically, and now you basically say that we can basically do, and we're basically going to do it to other nations. Well, you're basically doing it here at home, and look what we're doing. We're basically destroying our country based on lies, and essentially trying to usurp an actual election. And what you're doing out there in Venezuela is the same thing. That was a duly elected leader, and you were basically trying to say, oh no, we're going to say this person's the leader. Well, no, that's not how things work. You don't get to assume someone's a leader just because you like them better. That's not how elections work. And that's essentially what they're trying to do. They're trying to basically do what the Democrats are trying to do to Trump, and trying to say, oh no, we don't like the election, so we're just going to make Hillary Clinton the president. And that's essentially what the Democrats were trying to do, and because they didn't like the outcome of the election. And they're trying to come up with how the Democrats were coming up with every lie, and that's essentially the exact copy of what's happening in Venezuela. Is they're trying to make this person who's essentially a person with no support. I mean, we have 700 people behind him. He has no support. There's no legitimacy to it. And when we look at him, it's basically looking like essentially just another coup, just like we had out in Iraq, just like we had out in all these other countries. And you look what we did out in the Middle East and out in Central Asia, and everything's broken apart, and we created so much havoc. And if it wasn't for the Shia Islamic groups stepping in and covering up those areas, we would basically have terrorism roaming the whole region. And that's the only thing that's kept it in one piece. And if it's not because of what we did, it's because of what they did to essentially piece together the whole region. And they were able to kind of piece things together, piece things kind of back together, where you have some type of order. And this is what ends up happening when you intervene. You cause so much chaos that in most cases the only outcome is you get these horrible groups taking over. And in many cases you can have anything from terrorist groups to violent gangs taking over power in these countries. And this is what happens when you do intervention. Intervention, you have to understand, you're never going to get the ideal outcome. You need to take the ideal outcome, what you think is going to happen in your head, and throw it away. People like John Bolton, like Hillary Clinton, like Barack Obama, like George W. Bush, like all of these people, like Fareed Zakaria, Bill Kristol. I can keep like Marco Rubio, and all the like are basically living in a fantasy world. You cannot go into a region, expect an ideal outcome to ever come true. What's always going to happen is you're always going to get the worst possible outcome, because when you intervene, you're not going to get this ideal outcome, because if they're willing to fight for their country to get those outcomes, they would have done it themselves. And being that they haven't, you're never going to get those. You're going to get the worst possible outcomes, which means those willing to step right in for the areas that essentially you've blown apart. When you take out a secular dictator, you're going to get terrorism or violent gangs in those regions. That's the same thing that always happens. You take out Maduro, you're going to get Juan Guaido, a person that believes in violent overthrows, and that's basically what he is. He's basically a violent thug, and people should think of him no differently. This is a person that's been trained in a lot of guerrilla tactics and a lot of violent overthrows, and this is the way he reacts to people. And he's not a peaceful man. Never has been. Never will be. So when you're basically taking out Maduro, who's essentially done, yes, he's done really bad things, you're basically saying, okay, we're going to take out this bad person and we're going to put in someone who's 10 times worse. And that's essentially what you're doing. But you're saying, oh, but it's capitalism. Well, sort of. It's not really capitalism. It's actually going to be a crony capitalism, and it's basically going to put the people in such a horrible situation that they would have been better off just leaving it with socialism and voting their way out with an actual leader that actually cares about their situation. And it happens naturally with the spread of ideas. This is why ideas are the way to actually go. And this is why when we look at these situations, you need to look at it like that. Just because you say we don't need to intervene does not mean that you're for Maduro. That's not what you're stating. You're not stating, oh, we're for Maduro or for the horrible treatment of these people. You're stating that the U.S. Number one, has no role in intervention, and number two, it has no legitimacy to make these decisions for these people. These people are free individuals. I mean, they have the freedom to make their own decisions, and if they don't vote for this crazy person that you basically want to put in office, that means they didn't vote for him. Just like in the Crimean vote, they weren't going to vote for a neo-Nazi because of the West putting the person up, and the West trying to drive out the previous Ukrainian leader that was actually a person that would have been more friendly with Russia than with NATO, and that was the reason why they wanted the previous guy out. They wanted him out because he wasn't going to join NATO, and the West was not going to have it. So they drove him out by putting in these militant forces and arming these militant forces, put in a neo-Nazi, and expected the Jewish people in Crimea to essentially accept a neo-Nazi as their leader. Well, Jews and neo-Nazis don't exactly get along. Well, it's the same thing here. When you put essentially a violent person, a violent sociopath to overthrow Maduro, he's not going to, the people aren't going to essentially react positively. We have, the military is not, didn't arrest Guaido because the fact is they knew that it was only going to go into what the West wanted to play into their plans. And what you have with it, as you had, was kind of funny, was that they were trying to say, oh yeah, it's working right into our plans because the military is not obeying Maduro. Well, guess what? They were obeying Maduro because Maduro ordered them not to arrest Guaido, because the fact is it would have played right into his plans. Otherwise, Guaido wouldn't have tried to tell these people, these small amounts of followers, to stage violent protests. If it was directly into, if these people were essentially violating Maduro's orders, he would have never said that. Guaido wouldn't be stating things like that if that were the case. This shows that basically is the people are essentially mostly by a heavy margin against Guaido, and it's well over 99% of these people are against Guaido. So if there were an election held today, it would be basically there would be some people that would vote for another third type of party. You'd have your people voting for Maduro, and basically you'd have this group of about 700 people voting for Guaido. Guaido would basically be laughed out of office. He has no support. They think he's basically nothing but a violent thug, which he is. He's no different than people like El Chapo or any of those other violent thugs out there that basically should be behind bars. Just because he has a political position does not mean that he is any different than any other violent thug. And he's just because he proclaims himself to be capitalist does not make it any different. He's not a real capitalist because he doesn't believe in voluntary exchange. He doesn't believe in any type of nonviolent in any non-aggression principle. He doesn't believe in any of the ideas of voluntary exchange. He doesn't believe in any of these things that are basically natural to pure capitalism. He basically believes in this idea of crony capitalism and basically graft, and which is pretty much the same idea of what you'll find with a lot of people of the of the original Progressive Party, and of people like Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama, these type of people who basically want to commit massive graft and want to run over the rights of the citizens. And this is not exactly a pro-liberty person that they're exactly going to tolerate. They know it might be bad under Maduro, but basically it's not. They're not basically going to be harassed in the streets at any worse than they are now. With their situation is basically solely dependent on their economic status, and that's basically what's going on. And when it comes down to Maduro, when it comes down to Guaido, that's not going to be based on it. That is going to be based on their situation is going to be based on their support of Guaido, and their personal well-being is going to be based on how well do they support Guaido. And if they don't support Guaido, things are going to get real bad for those individual people, because Guaido is an actual thug. And that's what we're talking about here. And when you put someone like that in power, he's going to be essentially a tyrant. And that's essentially what we're backing. We're backing a tyrant instead of backing a person that is actually legitimate and wants actually voluntary exchange and a non-aggression principle. But we're not going to see anybody back those ideas that are going to be under the guise of people that are going to be supported from the CIA, from people like John Bolton. And because what we're seeing right now is Trump is basically getting not the whole intelligence reports, but he's only getting highlights from John Bolton. This means he's not even getting the whole story. And he's just basically going to be getting an adopted version from John Bolton, which means that even when he's speaking, he's speaking essentially out there. He's speaking from essentially about intelligence through the tongue of John Bolton, which is completely neocon and completely warmongerish, not knowing anything what he's talking about, because essentially he has not gotten a word what he needs. And this is the whole point that needs to be understood when we're talking about this situation. And until he gets rid of morons like this so he can actually get the full news, this is all he's going to be getting. He's going to be getting a small piece of the story. He's not going to be getting the full thing, and they don't want him to have this. Now, if Trump were smart, he would essentially either A, ignore the civilian intelligence, or B, try to call on Congress to eventually eliminate civilian intelligence, because it essentially is not even, number one, not even constitutional, and number two, it's not, it's completely, it's been inaccurate and the starter of all wars since the actual, since it's actually started to begin with. Because the only reason why we created any of these civilian agencies was to, essentially the FBI was to aid in criminal investigations, and the FBI came too big, so they started creating more civilian agencies to take care of what the next civilian agency was with it. So it'd be like the NSA, then we create the next one to take care of that one, then we take care of the next one to do with that one, and then when it ends up, you create the CIA to deal with the FBI, then you create the NSA to deal with the CIA, then you create the FISA system to deal with the NSA, and then the FISA system becomes too big, and then you end up with this whole big mess. Now, what you could do, instead of creating more of these agencies, you get rid of the agencies. Get rid of FISA, get rid of the NSA, get rid of the CIA, get rid of the FBI, and you start going all the way down the list, and you're going to realize that you don't have to have any of these agencies that are basically civilian intelligence, and you're going to realize, and then get rid of, when it comes down to advisors, only take intelligence from the military intelligence. Why? Because the military intelligence actually takes an oath to the Constitution. Why is this important? Because the Constitution is the actual rule book of the country, and these people understand, when it comes down to it, is they understand that we're not supposed to have entangling alliances, and they also have a self-preservation to act for their own lives, which means they're not going to push for war. They don't have a need to do this because of where they're at. They're not going to be linked with other companies to basically sell more gear when it comes down to it. They're essentially going to be going from the position of what is best for just the basic needs of national security. That's it. And then that's why when we get to these things, you're going to see that a situation like Venezuela or any of these other countries, it's not going to have any impact in the U.S. because they're going to say, okay, we don't have to have sanctions on them. We'll just have basic natural trade. We're not going to select a leader for them. They have the full right as a sovereign nation to select a leader. And what would happen is they would have Maduro, and then when they got sick of Maduro, they would select a leader from people who would most likely be advocates for complete voluntary trade and non-aggression principles, and not go for a psychopath like someone like Juan Guaido that believes in overthrowing governments and these more of this intervention nonsense, and trying to essentially start violent fights with the actual current regime by having these violent protesters react. I mean, it was his people that actually blew up the actual aid truck that actually caused the whole media to jump on Maduro to begin with. It was not Maduro's military. Maduro's military was like well away from the actual situation. It was a Molotov cocktail threw by one of Juan Guaido's supporters that actually hit the actual aid truck that blew it up. That's how it happened. Everything needs to be looked at legitimately, and that's where it goes to. When you have these people, these all they are their agitators and their violent thugs. This is basically nothing more than a terrorist group. And when you do this, you're essentially putting in a terrorist group in charge of a nation. And when you do that, you're not going to have a healthy outcome. It's basically going to be a copy of what we did out in Afghanistan in the 70s, where because we did not like Russia, we gave weapons and we were arming the Mujahideen out in Afghanistan to attack Russia, and that ended up being what became Al Qaeda under Osama bin Laden, because we were arming Osama bin Laden at that time. And guess what happened with that? Everyone knows what happened later with that, when he actually essentially bit us on the backside and ended up attacking the United States. Now we can pretty much take a wild guess what happens if this moron gets elected as leader, gets elected and becomes the head, or gets put in as the head of Venezuela. We can take a wild guess what's going to happen between U.S.-Venezuelan relations. Is you can pretty much guess that 20 years down the road, Venezuela is going to attack the United States through some type of violent attack, and it's going to be Juan Guaido who's going to be the one arranging it. Just because that's what he basically is going to be doing. When we look at it, we need to understand this is what he does, and that's what needs to be understood. And when we look at these interventions, this is every time it happens. Now instead, we can actually do the opposite: not intervene, mind our business, and get out of it. And you're never going to find this from the legacy media or these pro-Trump sources, because the pro-Trump sources are going to reiterate what Trump is saying, which is being basically parroting what Bolton is giving him, which is basically this intervention garbage. Which is why he turned tail on the Syria situation, which is why he turned tail on the Afghanistan situation. Because the fact is he's essentially listening to Bolton on everything. And he thinks because Bolton came from Fox, he must know what he's doing. Meanwhile, Bolton is one of the morons behind the Iraq War. Now, before, Trump believed the Iraq War was one of the worst things in the world. Now he decides the Iraq War. Now he decides he forgot that Bolton was behind the Iraq War push. This is why we need to actually get people who are kind of a lot more aware. Now, this is one of the problems with Trump being completely unaware of what he's doing. He needs to understand these things. Now, I'm not saying we need to necessarily switch, but he needs to have more speeches with he needs to have more talks with people like Rand Paul, who actually know what's going on. And Paul will tell him that basically who John Bolton is, that he's a complete and utter moron, and that he's basically responsible for basically what's going on now. And that John Bolton was essentially not on line for voting for Trump, but in fact, he was actually a major Hillary Clinton supporter. In fact, when it came down to a lot of the election stuff, he was actually, in many ways, on foreign policy, an advisor for her. So if we want to talk about what we're talking about for advising, where the thing should go with it, he should understand that he basically bring on a Hillary Clinton advisor when it came down to foreign policy. And this is what you're getting with John Bolton. And that's what you have with it, and he should really consider dismissing Bolton from his staff, because because guys like Bolton, guys like Elliot Abrams are making these situations a lot worse. He needs to really think about getting people who actually want to start removing these troops and get back down to what actually matters, which is peace. When we look at peace, that's actually what we need to look towards. And that should be the focus of the actual goal. Understanding that the U.S. should not be engaged in these foreign wars, or actually engaging in the actions of basically trying to make the decisions for other countries. We should basically be only looking at what the national security interests are for our country only. And we obviously know that Venezuela has nothing to do with our country. We shouldn't be making decisions based on feelings. Feelings don't matter. We look in the Middle East. Is there any legitimate reason we're in the Middle East? No. There's no legitimate reason we're in the Middle East. It's only causes a security risk. It doesn't matter that you can try to make the statement saying, "Oh, but we have business interests out there." Well, it's not the government's job to provide security for business. It's their job to provide security for themselves. If they can't do it and they find it too much of a risk, they should just leave. And that's the blunt truth of it all. It's not the government's job to provide security for international business interests. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that. When it says to provide for the common defense, it does not mean to provide for that for business when they're overseas. It's only for the actual states and territories that we actually own ourselves, and that's within the United States, and that's it. Now, when we look at what that would do is they would pull us out of the Middle East as well. They'd pull us out of Central Asia. We also need to look at when it comes to militarily, from our military. And our military really only needs a budget of about $250 billion to survive on a very, very high level. And this would still be the most expensive military in the world. But what it would do is it would only function for the United States and its territories only. And what this would do is it would allow us to set up many bases here at home, and it would allow us to essentially guard our nations alone and no other nations allowed, and make sure that all other nations become responsible for themselves, which is essentially what we were meant to do. As when we look to the writers of the Constitution, they stated specifically that we're not supposed to have entangling alliances. This is why when we look to the Venezuelan situation, we see that basically that's essentially by trying to intervene and doing this, that's essentially somewhat of an entangling alliance. And that should be looked negatively. And it doesn't matter what we're looking at across the globe. We should not have any of this. And it basically what we're doing is we're essentially trying to exert force and basically trying to change what these people want to do naturally, and that's not essentially what is constitutional, nor what was the intention of the founders. And when saying what the actual purpose was basically we were not supposed to have any allies. The only allies we were supposed to have, basically we weren't even supposed to have any allies themselves with it, because the fact is when you engage in, and when you have one ally, we were supposed to view it basically as, is this going to be reciprocated back and forth? And that was especially the way we were supposed to view it. And that's why when we thought about the idea of an alliance with another nation, we would examine it to a great degree, because the reason why they didn't want these long entangling ones, was because when you start to do this, is you could have many countries that are essentially going to jump in and basically say, okay, we're going to be connected with you for a long time, but we're not going to reciprocate. You look at the case of, let's say, Israel, for instance, or Saudi Arabia or UAE or something. And you see that basically they have never reciprocated. When we look at the actual alliance between the nations, between our nations, Israel has never reciprocated. Look after 9/11. Did they do anything for us? Nothing. They never engaged in anything. And this was basically, I mean, what they did with it after 9/11 was essentially their leader was trying to petition for us to invade Iraq. I mean, that has nothing to do with it. When we were trying to go after the person that attacked us, their leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, was essentially trying to get us to invade another country. That seems to be quite insane, that their leader is essentially trying to get us to invade another country when it's completely illegitimate. And that's what he was trying to do with it during this whole period. And when we look at it, it shows how little that they actually cared about our actual dealing with the attack and actually finding the attackers. He was more concerned about their leader was actually more concerned about actually starting a new war because they wanted to remake the Middle East. They felt no concern about actually contributing to actually find the person that perpetuated this attack. Yet when it comes down to it, is we offer them aid constantly. We send them over aid. We send them over from military to humanitarian aid constantly. We're basically paying for a lot of their government through subsidies. We're basically paying a lot of things to their government, as well as a lot of other Western nations are, and essentially getting nothing back. When it comes to people tend to put the argument about intelligence, but their intelligence has been faulty, and it's never paid back with it. They were the ones who, their intelligence has stated that Iran has nuclear weapons. Well, the UN has gone through and done searches and done thorough searches, and they've never found one. They've been using this argument since throughout the 90s, and they've never and even to date with it, they have not found one. They were the ones that said that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. We've gone through Iraq with basically with a fine-tooth comb, and we did find one weapon of mass destruction. Thus, we know that their intelligence is completely faulty, and it's only about pushing forward an option of intervention to basically suit their actual neoconservative needs and aspirations, and basically making us put up the bill, which has actually caused our country countless trillions of dollars, and basically killed millions upon millions of people, both from the military aspect and from actual innocent civilians. And when we look at this, we need to understand that that's not what an ally does. And this is why when we look at the idea of looking at what an ally is you need to start looking at legitimate points of, is it reciprocated? And if it's not reciprocated, you need to start looking at retracting these alliances and saying, no more, we're not having this alliance anymore, because this is not, it has never been reciprocated. You have never done any type of work for it, and you don't just basically say, we're going to make you pay with it, how Trump says with the idea of, let's say, NATO. You don't just say, you have to pay more. No, It's what you do is the way you handle these is you say, we're exiting this alliance, because the fact is if it's not reciprocated, you look at NATO. NATO never reciprocated when we were attacked. If you look at the bylaws of NATO, they're supposed to essentially defend when an actual nation is attacked. They didn't do diddly squat. And that was actually within the, if you look at the bylaws of the actual thing, they didn't do anything. Now that they came right in to attack Iraq, but when it comes down to actually searching for bin Laden and the other people who committed the attacks on 9/11, they did nothing. Now you're supposed to actually defend the actual nations of NATO, and it's supposed to be equal. Whenever one nation gets attacked, all the other ones are supposed to come right in. And guess what? Almost nobody came into even at the start. A couple of ones came in at the start with it, but then they faded out and did nothing later on. And this is just an actual fact of what goes on. And that means it's not being reciprocated, and that means they're not even following the actual bylaws of what's going on. And when we look at this, we can see that that this is why we end up treating the idea of an alliance seriously. Thus, when we do things internationally, we need to understand is what our role is. And our role should actually be only to look out for our own interest. Thus, when we get back to the idea of Venezuela, this is something serious that we need to understand. They're not an actual interest to the United States. They have no interest at all. We should not be deciding their elections. We should not be deciding any elections of any other country. Doesn't matter if we think they're fair or not. Even if we don't think they're fair, even if we think they're rigged, it's not our business. And that's the whole point. So when it comes down to who's the bad guy with it, basically the one who's the bad guy is the ones who are basically trying to intervene, trying to decide a leader, which would be the Western nations that are trying to intervene. It's also the ones that are actually, it's also the guy that wants to basically start a violent revolution, which is Juan Guaido. Now, while I do not like any socialist leader around the globe, I do not like the socialist system because it always ends, or virtually almost always ends, in democide, and I will stand by that. But the fact is when we look at it, he's basically Maduro is essentially being attacked here, and they're essentially saying we're gonna get rid of you and kill you. And we're looking for the perfect opportunity, and this is what people like John Bolton are essentially saying. And essentially, John Bolton has been so far outfoxed by Maduro to this point. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure to share this on social media. And make sure to check out my Patreon page and share that around if you could, any information on that. And that's about it. This will be my last for my live streams for tonight, and I'll in a few minutes I'll post I'll start working on posting my podcast for the day. Bye, everyone.